So basically, quitting for Omar Hamzawi, as I said, quitting the revolutionary spirit could be very much seen as fear to become Uthman, his friend who was imprisoned multiple times. So basically can be seen as success of the government disciplining the intellectuals and scaring them of continuing to become activists. It is very important, I think, to note Mustafa al-Minyawi's, who is a friend of Omar Hamzawi. Mustafa al-Minyawi is a very interesting character. He's the intellectual who very much can be seen as the extension of Raouf Alwan. He's the intellectual who is represented as someone who was a fine artist and metamorphosed into being the trivial entertainer. It becomes basically instead of someone who is still the fine artist, he becomes the popcorn entertainer style. Mustafa's philosophy of popcorn entertainment is significant because it represents the contradiction again between preaching for the revolution as an ideal and actually versus the actual transformation of this revolution from an ideal to a reality. So Mustafa's character is very interesting because it exemplifies the failure of transforming the revolution from an ideal to reality. It's very much emphasized. Mustafa had the discussion with Omar, a very similar discussion to what Raouf had with Said in The Thief of the Dogs. They say basically that we now have a socialist government, so there is no reason for us to continue preaching for socialist values. So basically this is their justification for their transformation. Uthman Khalil, on the other hand, the activist that I talked about before, is quite an important character because he is seen as the one intellectual who has values and continues to fight for them, even if he gets imprisoned multiple times throughout the entire novel. Uthman's reference to scientific socialism as the magical solution is extremely important because it explains the extreme disappointment of some intellectuals to see the revolution failing to bring the magic solution, or failing to bring social justice was extremely depressing for them because they had such high hopes in it. It's basically reflecting the contradiction between the dream that was associated with Nasser and the reality of the regime that was portrayed later on by Mahfouz. It's important to note that The Thief and the Dogs and The Beggar both start and end by prison. The thief, or Said in Robin Hood in The Thief and the Dogs, comes out of prison and ends up dying, so that can be seen as a form of prison, or it can be seen as liberation, actually, that death is liberation under this context because the context is very oppressive. While Omar in The Beggar is different. He basically ends his life by the police taking him back by being forced to be taken back to his house after his self-imposed exile, which shows taken back to the society, taken back to the same situation that he was in, and being depressed about it for going back to a society who will not understand it. Basically, he's forced to go back to his conventional life where no one understands him, which is much darker, I think, and much more pessimistic than Said in The Thief and the Dogs. Said's death in The Thief and the Dogs, because Said's death can be seen as liberating in one way or another. But Omar in The Beggar is dark. He ends up being imprisoned for all his life under the society's rules, basically, and society's misunderstanding. The aforementioned can all be seen as an antithesis to the intellectual's existence, symbolizing freedom restraints that characterize the Nasserite era. I then continue in my paper to talk about Adrift on the Nile. The novel is set on a boat filled with absentee intellectuals where they chose self-imposed exile by absenting themselves because they feel like their life lost meaning and they are unneeded by the society, nor are they needed by the state anymore. They reject all society's core values and opt for self-intellectual exile, where they create an alternate society of almost a full absenteeism. They're always high, and the main link between every intellectual on the boat is their intellectual quarantine, where one can interpret this quarantine as not just an intellectual quarantine, but more society and state that forces them to be in that situation. Their self-imposed isolation is a facet of the intellectual crisis that characterized the Nasserite experiment. Samara Bahgat, however, the young journalist model of intellectual, can be seen very much as the extension of Uthman, the intellectual who used to always get imprisoned in the beggar, because they both still have hope to change and they continue their fight. She actually basically pulls back Anis, the main protagonist, who is the main absentee protagonist in The Thief and the Dogs, because of her faith in change. And Samara basically is the only one that continues to write, hoping to change the situation of Egypt, and attempts to convince the group of intellectuals, but fails only though Anis was the only one that she succeeds to help. Anis is the only intellectual portrayed by Mahfouz as the one who quarantines himself due to his inability to cope with inquiries that arise to him in the couple of hours he is sober in. Most of the time he's absent-minded, unlike others, because he's constantly relating to post-revolution 1952 failure, basically. And he struggles with the idea of how the revolution failed to bring its preached values, such as equality, so he rather becomes absent-minded. Hence, and this is why Anis was the only one to be able to be brought back by Samara, because he was the one that was portrayed the most, that was actually really caring about the situation, but was too depressed and hence chose self-imposed isolation. Basically, one can argue that the group of intellectuals chose self-imposed exile because they felt responsible one way or another for the state the country was in. Nonetheless, this is very much typical, their state here is very much typical to the Saidian concept of self-imposed exile. It's especially also linked to them feeling marginalized by the state, and it's linked to the regime's policy that I talked about before of prioritizing the people of trust over the people of experience. Finally, I'll talk about Miramar. Mahfouz here's representation has direct representation of intellectuals in this novel. The beauty of Miramar, it does not shed light on one type of intellectuals, but rather different models of intellectuals. One of the most important parts of or facets of Miramar is the working class intellectual crisis that was represented by Zohra and the corrupt opportunist intellectual Sarhan. The portrayal of the marginalization of the intellectual in Miramar is the clearest and most evident, whereby they felt that they were surplus to the society and they were not needed. Amir was the only intellectual that was portrayed as pure. His existence is vital, and because he's witnessed history in the making, different phases throughout. However, Amir portrayed as an isolated, silent, emotional Sufi and wise intellectual. Zohra, on the other hand, the Fallaha or the village girl, is the one who ran away from home in resistance to her parents marrying her off to an old man. She's very significant. She falls in love with Sarhan, and she falls into the opportunist defender intellectual trap and ends up pulling herself out of it, pulling herself out of the entire corrupt intellectual opportunist fascination and being independent of him, which can very much be seen as a call for the working class to make themselves independent from the opportunist intellectual part of the intellectual class or segment of the society. She does not give up, and she actually still is hopeful till the end of the novel, and she continues to try to be literate and to learn reading and writing. Finally, I will discuss my conclusion. I basically reflected on Mahfouz's intellectual representation as a possible reading of sociopolitics under the oppressive Nasserite era. There were many common themes that I reflected on. These themes included breaking the law and anarchism, the individual versus societal perceived gain, and the action versus thought-oriented intellectual and ivory tower theorizing. The idea of the search in the intellectual, accompanied by the lack of societal understanding, the half-mad, half-dead intellectual, very much exemplified in The Beggar, as I previously mentioned, and the theme of absurdity of life and fate. Intellectual isolation is also very, very prevalent and most important, and this was highlighted in all 4 novels and very common in all 4 novels. I would like to conclude by reading Mahfouz's quote about the 1952's revolution's contribution to literature, because I find it very important and relevant as a closing statement. He stated that the revolution did not benefit literature. Let us be objective and consider what was done during the revolution. The Ministry of Culture, the Supreme Council of Letters and Arts, the Writers' Society, the Story Club, institutes for theoretical, musical and cinematic arts, theaters, literary prizes. In spite of all of that, no one can claim that the last 20 years witnessed a literary flourishing that could stand any comparison with that in the aftermath of the 1919 revolution. Why is that so? The answer is very simple: the crisis of freedom. Thank you.